a job title that's something like DevOps engineer or cloud engineer? Awesome. How do you feel about that job title? Do you feel pretty proud that you are like the DevOps team in your company? Is that awesome? And then nobody else is allowed to do DevOps because you have effectively siloed it off into a new organization that does nothing but DevOps. So how many of you are familiar with DevOps? Cool. How many of you are doing something you would call DevOps right now? Or maybe something that other people would call DevOps, and not you. Okay, so it's maybe 2/3, maybe half people who have done it, and then the other third to a half people who are either not doing it or aren't familiar. It's a good balance. So I'll try and split up this talk. I was kind of thinking, depending on what kinds of folks showed up, how we would split up the time in terms of sort of intro material of like what this whole thing is all about versus sharing some of the war stories of how it's worked in your companies. So how many of you want to talk about how it's worked for you? Like for 1 minute or less? Nobody. Okay. Maybe we can get a few at the end. I guess if nobody wants to share their war stories, I can just make up a few or talk about some of the companies I'm familiar with. Okay, so I'm going to run through basically how I think about DevOps, what are the sort of the core tenets, and there's two sides to that. One of them is people, one of them is tooling, and talk about what those two sides are all about, kind of run through some of the trends that are happening in the space, a little bit about containers, although if you really want to dig into containers and Docker, there's another talk happening right now that you should probably go to, because this talk is just going to touch on the ideas more so than running through code bases. So we're going to talk about some of the philosophies, some of the ideas behind this whole DevOps movement, what it's all about, and hopefully I'll start defining it before I say it many more times for those of you who aren't familiar with it. So the way I think about DevOps, which is a combination of development and operations, to give you a little bit of context, is it's really just extending Agile software development through to the production environment. Right, so extending that Agile process, not just through development, but also into the test organization and into the production organization, right? So that you are doing something that resembles at least Agile style, 2-week sprints or something, and deploying those to production, rather than building something in 2-week sprints for 18 months and then passing it off to QA, and then passing it off to production at some point, right? Which kind of defeats the whole point of Agile. So we finally figured this out, 15 years later. So the one point I do want to make, when you think about, all right, DevOps is about pushing Agile through to production, is at least my philosophy on Agile, as somebody who's not an Agile consultant, is don't get tied up in the process. There are people who can make lots of money helping you do that process correctly and efficiently. But from my point of view, I'm a very pragmatic person. And so I think the ideas behind it is what's important, right? The important part is trying to ship something every 2 weeks to the users based on what the developers just built. Nice. Gotta love those font conversions to Windows. All right. Yeah, so I usually use a Mac. I had to turn it in last week. So now we're on a new laptop. Things are going to be a little bit interesting. Hopefully in a good way for the most part. So 3 kind of ideas behind Agile and therefore behind DevOps, right? Because that's just Agile in production is, 1, you're going to deliver something. Guaranteed, every time, right? If you're building something for 2 weeks, there's going to be something at the end of that 2 weeks. And the important part of doing this correctly is when you code something for 2 weeks, you need a product of some sort at the end of that 2 weeks, or whatever the period is, right? You need something you can actually run. You can't have just code that doesn't do anything. Otherwise, you haven't proven that you've built something that works, right? So how did it get through test if it doesn't work? So a few ideas. 1, you're going to deliver something. You're going to deliver a lot of somethings before a waterfall style deadline 18 months out. There's going to be a whole lot of things delivered between now and then. And finally, you may not have the same feature set you were hoping to, right? Which is sort of the main difference is you can't set requirements and say, we're going to deliver those in 18 months. Of course, the flip side is with waterfall, you also can't. You can just pretend you can, and then you fail to deliver by the deadline. So really, it's not so different after all. You just realize that and are pragmatic about it much sooner. So how about this? Test. Yes. All right. Good times. Okay, so if the idea of DevOps is carrying Agile all the way through, right? Trying to do this thing, ship software either every couple of weeks, maybe it's every couple of hours, maybe you're doing continuous delivery or continuous deployment, which means like every commit that goes into the code base, you're either shipping it or you're ready to ship it, which turns out is really easy for websites and really hard for everything else. Trying to ship like code to a mainframe every hour or so, you're like, yeah, we'll just update the OS. It's been running the same thing since 1973, but no worries. Now we're going to just update it every hour. That'll be cool. So that's a little bit more challenging to think about. Websites, really easy. Back-end APIs for mobile apps, really easy. Everything else is more challenging to figure out how does this all work. But we're going to talk about the ideas behind that. I'll let you think about how to apply those in your own organizations. Or we can grab a coffee or a beer afterwards and we can talk about that more. But the really important part of this, and the part that a lot of people don't appreciate yet in this whole DevOps conversation, is it's not just about developers and ops. It's much broader, right? Because what are those groups connecting? They're connecting the code base and the production deployment, and what's on either side of those? It's the business, right? Business analysts, people defining the requirements, thinking about what the customers and the users actually need, and the users themselves, right? So the really important part of DevOps to appreciate is it's about connecting your company, your organization, whatever it is, with the people using your product, right? And being able to iterate on that much more rapidly. So not just are you building a thing, but you're building the right thing. And if you didn't build the right thing 2 weeks ago, you now are able to iterate on that. Instead of doing the waterfall style thing, hey, we built this thing, it took us, maybe 18 months is unrealistic for some projects. Let's say it took us 6 months, right? We built this thing, we thought it was gonna be awesome. And it worked, it passed all the tests, but customers didn't care, right? The users don't give a crap. And that happens all the time. But if you're taking a sort of agile approach to it or continuous delivery approach to it, of shipping every couple of weeks, every couple of hours, whatever you're able to do, you're able to iterate on the market needs more effectively, right? And I hate talking about marketing with developers, with ops people, but you have to think about marketing not just from the perspective of like spewing BS out in the air, but from the perspective of what do the users need, right? What do the users need? How do you reach them with the right story about what they need to do, right? Which is actually kind of what I'm doing right now, right? This is a story about DevOps. So you could say, yeah, I'm marketing, although not for a company because I don't work for one at the moment. So, like I was saying, there's two sides of DevOps, right? One is people, the other is tools. And the people side of it is really about just doing collaboration right, instead of pretending that everything should be siloed. And it's a little bit of a cliche about siloed organizations, but it's a cliche because it's true so often, right? There are so many companies where you've got a dev team, you've got an ops team, you've got a test team. In fact, I was working with an insurance company a while back, and the development team was based in the Midwest somewhere. The ops team was based on the coast, which makes it really, really hard to collaborate effectively when you're not even in the same state, let alone in the same building. It makes it awfully difficult to sort of walk down the door to get all the people in the same room, which is really the goal, I think, of DevOps is you get all the people in the same room. And I think the challenging part for a lot of companies out there trying to do this is that room doesn't have to be a physical room, even though most companies are used to it being a physical room, right? It can be a virtual room, right? Slack, HipChat, IRC, take your pick. There's enough collaboration tools out there, and one of the things I've been doing for a long time, I've worked as an open source developer for probably 12 or 13 years now, and they've got it figured out, right? They know how to do collaboration right, how to do it in a global, distributed, asynchronous way, and how to deliver products that are, I would say, pretty much inarguably better than most things companies can build, at least in a lot of cases, right? When it's the sort of one-person operation, maybe not so much, but when you've got the sort of, Eric Raymond, who's a pretty famous philosopher in open source and free software, has this tenet that when you have enough eyes, all bugs are shallow, all right? And with open source code, at least you have the ability to have enough eyes. So really, it's about this collaboration idea. Get enough people involved with enough different viewpoints, right? So instead of having a bunch of white guys in their 30s building all the stuff who are all developers and come from the same background, why don't we have a little bit more diverse audience thinking about this, building this, looking at this, and working on it so that we build the right thing for the right people, right? And build it not just in a way that's fun for developers, but in a way that's supportable by operations, in a way that's effectively testable. If you can't if you build something that's a huge monolith that you can't unit test, it's not going to work out very well for you from a quality perspective. And there's actually a fantastic book by a guy named Michael Feathers that in almost every new thing that happens in technology, you can apply this book and the ideas in it. And I'm trying to remember exactly what it's called. It's something about, any of you, have you read that book? Something about legacy code, blah, blah, blah. Yes, Working Effectively with Legacy Code. Greatest book. I think it was, he wrote it probably close to 15 years ago now. And the core idea of this book and this theory is about how do you get unit test into your code base, right? And the idea is you keep creating sort of artificial walls such that behind the wall is the ugly mess, and in front of it is a place where you can start putting test in, right? And this is the same idea when you're thinking about, how do we do these migrations? How do we migrate to DevOps, for example? How do we migrate to cloud? Well, you put in a wall, hide the ugly stuff behind the wall for the time being, and move one piece across that wall as you can, right? So like if you're thinking about how do we get DevOps into our company, one piece at a time, one team at a time even, right? If you say like, one good example that happens in a lot of places just because mobile is sort of a new enough thing for companies that they don't have it integrated into their tech organizations is they take the team building the mobile app and supporting the mobile app on the back end and they say, we're going to do this DevOps thing there, right? And we'll get all these people in the same room, whether they're business analysts, developers, ops, tests, get them all in the same room so they can collaborate effectively and try this DevOps thing there. And if you can't get a big win from sort of the best possible case, then it's probably not the right time for your company and you should consider looking for a new job. But so, the people side, it is tear down all the silos, right? How can you get the people in the same room so they can collaborate, so you can build the right application from multiple perspectives, right? So like, let me give a concrete example of this because I've been kind of waving my hands around. So there was a group I was working with pretty recently, sort of a developer-led company, built this great product. It was actually a great market fit too. They even built the right thing. The problem was, well, as it happens, this company is called Twitter. They built something that wasn't production ready and production capable. It wasn't scalable. And so they had to bring in a Tiger team and basically rebuild it all from scratch, right? Because it didn't have the scalability they needed for a production environment. It kept, running out of memory, so they had to restart their JVM every couple hours. And, it happened because it was a development-led organization, and they brought in ops late in the cycle versus early in the design phase, where they could say, hey, maybe here's this thing you should do. Maybe it would be nice if you could effectively log. That'd be cool. It would be nice if, this thing scaled a little bit, right? Instead of, just hoping it does because you know the right thing to do, right? All these things that would be nice, and if you had ops input early in the process, you could have built it right in the first place. But they didn't. Now they're doing it much better, right? I mean, it's very rarely now that I see the fail whale that I used to see, probably 20 times a day because I spent way too much time on Twitter. But so that's the people side of it, right? Get all the people in the same room. The tooling side of it, I see it as having 3 pillars, right? The first one is this idea of infrastructure as code. Who is familiar with that? Or configuration management? About half, cool. So there's this tool, sort of the pioneer is called CF Engine, right? And the thing that even those of you who have used this probably don't realize is CF Engine 1.0 was released in 1993. It's 22 years old this year. So this stuff has been around for a while, right? I mean, Mark Burgess is like this insane genius. He's the guy who wrote CF Engine back then, and still doing it a long time later. But the thing that's interesting about this is, so these are 5 examples of configuration management where you can define what your server, what your applications look like in code instead of logging in to a terminal prompt and saying, apt-get install whatever, and then configuring it by hand, doing this sort of artisanal maintaining your servers. There's a guy named Randy Bias who has this great metaphor of cattle versus pets, right? In that the old approach to servers was you name them with a wonderful name, like it's probably a theme of maybe it's Disney characters or Star Trek characters or something, right? And every one of them is, carefully maintained because you don't want the poor Ewoks to die, You got to take care of those Ewoks, you know? But the new approach is cattle, right? Where, you know, if one of those cows gets sick, that's too bad. You take it up back and shoot it. And then you have some hamburger for dinner. And it's wonderful hamburger, and you go get a new cow, right? You don't worry about it, right? So like, mail servers, right? You call them mail server 1 through 10 instead of calling them, you know, Chewy and Han and all that stuff. So the interesting thing about this whole approach of infrastructure as code, right, cattle versus pets, is that every time the way we build technology changes, there's a new generation of this stuff that comes out to cope with it, right? Which is why I have these 5 logos up. So 93, CF Engine, right, gets the idea out there, although it really takes about 15 years for people to even catch on to this idea, right? It was probably the late 90s before most people even thought, even the early adopters thought about using something like CF Engine to automate their infrastructure. Then mid-2000s, along come Puppet and Chef. Why did they come along? Because CF Engine wasn't good at coping with the cloud. And that's about the time the cloud came around. So people said, wow, this stuff is great. It can cope with the cloud. We can do things like scale instead of, CF Engine was in a way designed for more of a pet approach to infrastructure, right? You could automate the server, but you still typically named the server. And that's just partially the philosophical approach at the time sort of stuck to CF Engine, but it is partially just that the cloud wasn't around. We didn't have this ability to scale. And then in the past couple of years, Salt and Ansible came out, right, which is the next generation of dealing with that problem of what we ran into at the time with Puppet and Chef was they weren't good at coping with servers that disappeared, with transient infrastructure where you're scaling up, scaling down, adding things, removing things. They just weren't good at that. Things have changed since then, but that's where Salt and Ansible came from, is the need to cope with transients in the cloud and scalability. So this is like my favorite example ever of the value of doing DevOps. So there was this hedge fund called Knight Capital. Knight Capital, and this is text, you don't have to read it. This is from an SEC investigation into what in the world happened. And what happened, in short, was they were taking the pet approach to maintaining their servers. And so they reused a flag that they had used like 10 years ago in the same code base to do something. Said, hey, we'll repurpose this flag. It's already there. This sounds great. It sounds efficient. They reused the flag and deployed the new code. They had 8 servers running this stuff, deployed the new code to 7 of them. They forgot about the 8th one. And then they activated the new flag on all 8. And suddenly, they were making all kinds of option calls and puts and stuff that were exactly the opposite of what they wanted to do. Losing money like you wouldn't believe. I think it was 45 minutes that it took for them to lose $460 million before they finally shut the thing down. And it doesn't get much more clear of sort of the tie to the value of doing things in an automated way, taking this approach of infrastructure as code, than losing $500 million in less than an hour. So if you're trying to make the case to your management about like, why should we do this thing, Knight Capital is a perfect example. Because it's not just financially great, but there's an open SEC investigation. You can point at the facts instead of like hearing that something happened inside somebody else's company. Like it's all out there to check out, which is great. So here is a little bit of data. I always like data because my background is as a scientist. And I went to Stack Overflow, pretty popular discussion forum for development stuff, and just plotted some of these trends over time in different config management frameworks. Because I wanted to take that idea that I was telling you earlier of there's different generations of this stuff happening and try and look at the data of whether that's supported, right? And you probably can't read the text up there, which is fine. The point that I want to make to you is you can see a very clear generational influence, right? That yellow line at the bottom that never goes anywhere is CF Engine because it peaked back here somewhere. And then the blue and the red are Puppet and Chef. Early, sort of mid-2011, they started really taking off on Stack Overflow. And then more recently, you saw Ansible and Salt start to pick up, right? For the reasons that I was just talking about, right? It's a couple of years ago. This is about early 2013. Puppet and Chef just weren't able to effectively cope with some of the needs of the new, approach to distributed systems, for example, right? Databases like Cassandra, much greater scalability in the cloud, and so on. So the first pillar, right, infrastructure as code. The second pillar, monitoring. All right, I was just talking about thinking about how do you build apps from an operational perspective. Well, you have to have logging, you have to have monitoring, you have to have configuration, you have to have scalability. You have to know what's going to happen in the case of failure, right? And so monitoring is one of these examples. And the hashtags at the top there were sort of, I guess, Twitter movements, if you will, around this whole idea of like monitoring is so terrible. And at first, I must be talking too fast or something. So the people behind these movements thought, wow, if we just complain long enough, something will change. It took them a year to figure out that's not going to happen. And so it went from this whole monitoring sucks of like, how about we build the way we think monitoring should be instead? And so that was the next step, right? So monitoring, how many people run Nagios somewhere? Nice. How many people ran Nagios 5 years ago? A little bit more. 10 years? No. So Nagios, and this is another example of stuff that's been around for a long, long time. So Nagios started in 1999. It's 16 years old this year. Actually started by a guy named Ethan Galstad who lives in St. Paul, which is pretty awesome. There's a company called Nagios Inc. So if you have needs for Nagios, they can help you with that. But so Nagios is sort of the old school approach to monitoring. And things have changed a little bit for him, but the old school approach, much like configuration management, is very artisanal in nature. Couldn't deal with transients very well, right? Servers appearing and disappearing. How do you handle that in your configuration? Well, you mostly don't. Whereas newer approaches to monitoring are much better at dealing with, one, servers appearing and disappearing, and two, scaling the software to deal with those changes in input data. So Nagios is the old approach, right? Can't do transients. It's a big monolith, effectively, right? And it's not very fun to write plugins for, but that's a whole other story. The new approach is a very different one of let's break this monolith down into a bunch of modules instead and do things from a modular approach, right? And whether that's monitoring data or monitoring logs, that's the new approach. And the thing that I find really interesting too about what's changed from moving from things like Nagios and Graphite, Graphite on the front end, which is incredibly ugly. Graphite on the back end is a great data store. But you can really learn a lot about what the software is going to be like to use just by looking at the logo. And think about like, wow, so they really went all out for that Graphite one, huh? Just like put some text into some font, put it in italics, and said, we're good. We're good. And those graphs are just sinfully ugly as well. But whereas you look at that little log with a mustache on it, that's for a piece of software called Logstash. I mean, there's some serious design sensibility in that software. Or Sensu, modern monitoring, same idea, right? Like the stuff, it doesn't just work, right? It used to be the requirement was it works, and that's it, we're good. Now the requirement is not just it works, but its usability is so much better, right? There's a design sensibility in there. It not just looks good, but the workflows make sense. And when you design for the way people are doing infrastructure at a certain time, the workflows are generally too inflexible to cope with changes to the way that works, right? To moving to the cattle metaphor, for example, moving to transients. It just doesn't work well in the software, certainly like in the graphical level, but even sometimes at the configuration level, right? Where if you've got like one huge configuration file for everything, you have to edit that file every time you want to like add or subtract a server, it's just not going to scale very well, and you don't even have to think too much about that. So the new approach, right, you've got tools like Logstash, like Sensu, like Kibana, which is basically an open source alternative to Splunk, right? Runs on top of Elasticsearch and Logstash. But the stuff, like, it just looks good. And although I will say it's a little bit embarrassing, so you've got Nagios and Graphite, they've got those texty logos. Unfortunately, Kibana was also really lazy, but at least they used a prettier font and put a picture in the background. So it's like one slow step forward. It's some kind of Neil Armstrong, like it's not the leap for mankind yet. And so a little bit more data, just looking at some of the changes in monitoring over time. Again, super hard to read, don't try and read it. The only point I want to make on this graph is like, so here's all the old school stuff. This is Kibana, this purple one that's just going crazy, right? So like people are really getting onto this idea. They're like, wait, there's usable software that I can do this with? This is amazing. And they pick it right up. And Sensu is that green line at the bottom is starting to do the same thing. I bet if I remade this graph right now, it would be going up much faster. So those are sort of the pillars, right? You've got the people side, you've got the technology side. There's a guy named Gene Kim who's been doing research into this area for a while. He's got some really cool data, and I don't show you this because hopefully I don't need to convince you because you're here, but you might need to convince your bosses, your businesses that this is worth doing, and so that's what Gene is great for, right? He's got all kinds of great data. He's dug into this survey that's been run by Puppet and by ThoughtWorks about DevOps, right? Got like 9,000 people to answer the survey. Got to really dig into some of the data on like how this is working out for people. And so one of the things they asked on that survey was, so how's your company doing? And it turned out that high-performing IT organizations were very good predictors of high-performing companies from a market perspective, from a business perspective, like stock price, which is really interesting, right? I mean, that's the bottom line on there. 2x more likely to exceed profitability, blah, blah, blah goals. Productivity, of course, is not a surprise. Another just like nice piece of information for people doing this stuff, there's a bunch of companies doing it. Pick your industry, there's probably people doing it that are publicly known. And one of the things that has been really cool to watch in DevOps is this sort of breaking down of the silos, and collaboration isn't just inside companies, it's across companies as well. So the shirt I'm wearing right now is from a conference that I co-organized with a bunch of other people, some of whom are in the audience, called DevOpsDays Minneapolis last summer. We're running another one this summer in July. So this is mostly not a pitch for the conference, but partially it's a pitch for the conference. And, oh yeah, I should say, as a closer to my pitch, there are 50 spots available for 20% off discounts if you use the mini bar all caps discount code. So you should do that and come this summer, because we're going to actually dig into the things that I'm just sort of waving my hands about, right? Like, how does this work in companies to do this? How's it working out for people? What kinds of software are they doing? How are they doing them? There's somebody, sort of the main organizer of this conference is Bridget Cromhout, who's fairly well known in the DevOps community in Minneapolis and well beyond that. And she just gave an amazing talk on, basically they moved the whole company to doing Docker. And then they figured out, maybe that was a little bit too far. We should probably step back from this container thing a little bit. But it was not just talking about the ideas, but she's got all kinds of code and configuration and all the stuff that just takes forever to figure out and debug in there. So useful. And that's the kind of stuff that you get if you actually show up for the conference. But yeah, so people are doing this DevOps thing all over the place. Pick your vertical. It's not just sort of the trendy web companies and software vendors anymore. It's defense industry. It's government. It's car manufacturers. It's Lego. I mean, Lego's a cool one. I like that. And this is a little bit of data that I had Gene and one of the other survey authors named Nicole pull together. And the question I had was, is it possible to do this in big companies, or is it just a small company thing? How many of you work at a company with like more than 1,000 people? Awesome. How many of those companies are named Best Buy or Target? No. Nice, cool. Yeah, so the question I had was, can you actually make this thing work in a big company or not? And so they were kind enough to take some time, went back to that DevOps survey I was talking about and broke it down by company size. And basically, you've got green, yellow, red from left to right. Green means you're a high-performing DevOps organization, and they've got all kinds of factors for what goes into that I'm not going to talk about right now. But then going up and down is the size of the company they worked in. And so at the very bottom is 1 to 4, at the very top is 10,000 plus. And you can see super clearly, it's really blindingly obvious that the green goes smaller and smaller as the company gets bigger, right? So it's clearly harder. But the point that's really worth making here is it's still incredibly possible, right? I mean, that's not 0, that's not 5%, that's 20% that are sort of these high-performing DevOps shops of people who are interested enough in DevOps to hear about this Puppet survey and take it. But that's pretty good, I mean, from my point of view, right? That still means an 80%, not failure rate, let's say working on it rate, because a lot of them, as you can see, are in that middle ground, right? There's only a little over 20% that are doing terrible, which is really pretty impressive to me, thinking about companies that size and all the bureaucracy and crap you got to deal with to do anything. But so it's possible for anybody. You can do it too. So this is an idea that I see. I was talking about configuration management and how that's changing things. What does that mean over time as like you've got these new generations of configuration management coming out that deal with transients, scalability, blah, blah, blah. now what's happening is there's not new software called containers, but software that's become more easily usable that builds on containers, right? Docker is the primary example of this. And one of the ways I see this working, right? So how do you make DevOps work and how do you integrate containers into this is you rotate the roles of development and IT so that instead of there being a vertical firewall, there's a horizontal firewall, right? In that developers are supporting the code they wrote when it's in production, right? And this is how you do it right, is you have to build empathy both ways, right? So you got, and how do you build empathy, right? 1, you share tooling. 2, you're in the same room, physical or virtual. And 3, you understand the other's roles and you participate in owning your part of the stack all the way through. All right, so that means developers on call. That means IT people who understand how much it sucks to maintain a development environment, you know, all that good stuff, right? And participating in the design process, like I was talking about earlier, so that you're building an IT supportable application and not just one that was really fun. And so how do you make that work in reality? Well, you have an environment where IT builds the lower part of the stack, right? They create the foundation and it ships everywhere. There's a tool called Vagrant that uses lots of backends like VirtualBox to do this, where you can build out exactly the same foundational environment everywhere and then just code on top of it, right? Infrastructure as code for a VM, and then ship that VM to all the developer systems, ship that VM to all the testers, and you can even run that in production, right? Whether it's as a VM or they've got backends for things like AWS as well. And then on the top, you know, the idea of developers supporting their applications in production, right? Well, how do you do that when a lot of IT ops organizations, right, are pretty conservative? They don't want to give developers a login to the production environment, as they probably shouldn't. But if you think about this in the context of containers, well, what if the application is deployed as a container, right? The developer owns the container. They're responsible for what's inside the container, not for what's outside of it, right? So the clean interface is the interface between the container and the rest of the system, right? IT maintains the foundation, development maintains the application, right? And there's a clean handoff and not something that is completely absurd. Like one thing I ran into pretty recently was, so there was this application, it was running something pretty important for the business, and there was a bug in it, so they had to restart the JVM every 4 hours. This was, I think it was a banking site. So just memory leaks, all that good stuff. But what had happened was the development team already moved on to a different product. And so they couldn't get any developer time to fix the bug. So IT said, oh, well, we'll just put a cron job in then, right? So like, just think about like your bank website. There's a cron job running somewhere behind the scenes that's kicking the JVM every 4 hours. And that's what enterprise IT looks like, folks. And this, I actually gave this talk at an SAP conference a while back, and I just wanted to put up an example to say, like, this is possible, right? I already showed some data. This is possible in really large companies. This is also possible in really conservative environments, right? This isn't just for building your web app. People are doing this with like their ERP systems. People are doing this with like business objects, which is not a lot of fun to use, but you can automate any infrastructure, right? There's people in sort of the SAP world, which is a very different world than the one most of us live in, doing this DevOps thing, defining infrastructure as code for the most boring of technologies inside of a company. Let's see. How am I doing on time? Do I have to wrap at 10? Sounds about right. When's the next session start, anybody? 10:15? Okay, cool. Because I want to get through some of this stuff so that hopefully some of you can share your war stories for the last 10 minutes or so. So building the empathy, right, this is the important part. Getting people in the same room, sharing the same tools, right? Tools like Vagrant, where developers can build their VMs around Vagrant. Ops can also build VMs around Vagrant, right? It's a kind of a sharing ground for building that empathy, right? Because they're using the same tools to define the infrastructure. And that's how you build the empathy in the first place, is using the same tools, understanding where the other side is coming from. So once you start bringing approaches of development to operations, approaches of operations to production, you come up with pretty good, interesting ideas like, what if, now that we're defining our infrastructure like code, what if we tested it? Wouldn't that be incredible? it would be so great if we could not just write this stuff down, but know that it was gonna work before we deployed it to production, or even before we deployed it to staging, right? And in fact, this is critical if you're taking sort of a continuous delivery approach, because there isn't really a staging, right? You push stuff through, and if it works, it gets deployed, and that's the end of it, right? And so it's all the more important that you're able to effectively test in an automated fashion, right? You can't have like the testing lab of, you know, mechanical Turk people like playing with your GUI to see if something falls over randomly. You have to take a much more automated approach to it, because you can't deploy every 2 hours if you've got to send stuff off to a test lab. And so here's some examples of that. The one on the bottom right is obviously called Beaker, as you would expect. That's for Puppet. Kitchen CI for Chef. Service Spec can do basically anything. But this is sort of the new approach, right? If you imagine what do the philosophies look like, that's what happens. I'm going to skip some of that stuff. Skip that. Skip that. Skip that. Who wants to talk about microservices? Anybody? No. Good. Because we can wave our hands about that. Okay, so here's a really cool just sort of diagram to think about DevOps and think about like where it fits in. It's not mine, but I really like it for explaining this again to like businessy type people, where they're like, what is this whole DevOps thing, and like how does this fit into the way we do technology today, right? And well, it fits in by just sort of extending things another step, right? Every one of these processes, right? You start Agile, you move to CI, right? You integrate test into the Agile process. You move to CD, you've got it ready to deploy to production. And I think the distinction that's interesting to make here is continuous delivery and continuous deployment. Who is not clear on what the difference is between those two things? Wow, you know it. You people are great. This is awesome. So for you, the difference is confusing but clear at the same time, right? In that you can say these two words and you're like, all right, delivering, deployment, whatever. Continuous delivery means it's ready to ship, right? You've built something that is ready to deploy to production. You're waiting for a push button somewhere, right? Maybe it's a product manager who has to okay stuff before it ships, even though it passed all your tests. Continuous deployment means it's going out, right? Every single time you make a commit, or maybe every few hours they wrap everything up if they haven't quite gotten there yet, it's all automated all the way through. That's continuous deployment, right? You make a commitment, and an hour later, it's in production. This is, interestingly, I was doing this about 10 years ago with Gentoo Linux, which was kind of weird. Like, the term didn't even exist at the time. But every time that we made a change in development, it reached users inside of an hour. I was like, wow, it was terrifying, but we were pioneers, and actually users loved it, right? They said, like, especially when they are allowed to collaborate in this development process, right? And there's all kinds of biz speak words like co-innovation. But they love being able to say, like, hey, I reported this bug, I've got the fix now, right? And as developers, a lot of us are used to that and saying, like, oh, yeah, I sent a PR and it's in and we're good, right? But users are not used to that, and they love it, right? So this idea of taking like all these development concepts, all these concepts from sort of open source software, and saying like, why don't we do our business that way, is a really, it's sort of obvious in hindsight, but yet nobody's doing it, right? But so do that. So that's sort of the 40,000 foot view. Fonts didn't come out great on that because, yeah, Microsoft. But this is sort of the way I think about it, right? You can maximize agility doing this DevOps thing through a series of very concrete approaches to how you build, how you architect, how you deploy software. And these are some examples at various levels of the stack, from architecture all the way through to product. And this deck is up on SlideShare, so you don't have to like write all this stuff down if you're interested in doing so. Oh, yeah, I'm not going to end on that slide because that's my old company. So again, if you're trying to talk to companies about how you do this thing, there's this huge amount of literature on this idea called change management, right? And the really interesting concept from this approach is doing the change is almost the last thing you do, right? Most of what you do is proving the change will work and building enough momentum to make the change happen, right? So step one, create urgency, coalition, vision, blah, 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 blah. It's not even until step 6 that you start doing things. And this process, I mean, it works pretty well, right? And the whole idea is Sort of like the way people talk about OpenStack, where it becomes so popular that it's inevitably going to win, even though it's a pile of stuff. But so the idea is, right, you have to build this overwhelming idea that we have to do DevOps, we have to do it. Everything's falling apart. Firefighting is not the answer. And then do small wins, right, like the mobile team, for example, right? Small, easy wins versus the mainframe team, hard win. Smart meters that your electric company, if you're an electric company, is deploying, hard win. Website, easier win. Right? So you do those, and then you make it going from there. So with that, you said 10:15 is when the next talk starts. So I would love, does anybody want to share how DevOps has worked for them? Yeah, Bill. And yeah, come on up. Yeah, just come on up. Yeah, exactly. We'll get the mic. Yeah, well.
Where's the magic button that keeps making it do that? I'm Scott. I've been doing DevOps for a year. Now, I was brought into Bluestem Brands. I work at Bluestem Brands. It's a $1 billion a year e-commerce company. One thing that makes our problem a little bit more amenable is we don't have stores. It's a pure play e-commerce operation. So it brings a little focus to the problem. When I was hired, they had, what the slot I was hired into was leading infrastructure as a service team. And oddly, I'm not a data center dude. I'm almost not an infrastructure guy. And the reason I was hired is the product teams were looking for a different kind of conversation with operations. So my background is in leading app dev. I had some experience in operating. I led operations management for BestBuy.com for a while. It was a short stint. It was a bit out of character, but I did understand what leading ops at scale meant. So when I came in, the notion was to change the dialogue and change the relationship between what was happening in ops and what was happening in the build teams. We already, Bluestem had already established a culture of you build it, you run it. So the devs owned their code all the way through production, through the end of life of whatever it was they built, and that's a really positive thing and a really important thing. When we stood up DevOps, one of our goals was not to break that. So we weren't trying to create a situation in which they could build and abandon or throw it over the wall. The idea was to help them through parts of the process that they were sort of running out of bandwidth to deal with, to augment them with people focused on the problems that DevOps people focus on. The elevator speech when I came in was our goal was to shorten cycle time while improving quality, performance, availability, and security. So the function of DevOps is to shorten the cycle time and essentially make the software better. We don't focus on features. Turning the green button blue on the website or whatever they're doing this week isn't what we do. We did a non-functional work. In the first year, one of the interesting challenges was building a team with no approved hires. That was kind of a big first step. I came in the middle of a fiscal year and hired a bunch of people that I didn't have any approved headcount, so there was a miracle occurred at that moment. But the first few folks we brought in really demonstrated the power of the idea, and we had app teams trading contractor positions in their teams for DevOps people on my team. So we converted resource from the app dev teams into the DevOps practices because they could see the power of the idea. Let me see. The service set that we deliver is we do environment, so that's construct and manage the environment, not just really server, compute, and store, but we're beginning to take a bigger role in how load balancing is implemented. The company's moving pretty aggressively to microservices, and things change a lot with respect to how you think about the flow of the request and the response and so forth, and our team has a pretty big role in that. But provisioning environments and then managing those environments, we're pretty heavy Docker for our lower environments and our automated CI/CD processes. Then we also do build pipeline engineering. So when a new project team spins up, we're the people that help them with how their code will be managed and then how to get this engine of continuous delivery working for them. We do a lot with instrumentation and monitoring and availability management, that kind of thing. One of the things that we did early was we referenced the Spotify Agile paper. So if you Google Spotify Agile, it's going to be the first thing that pops up. It was an organizational principle about tribes, squads, and guilds. So one of the things that we did with delivering DevOps people into teams, and they are directly participating in the teams, we got away from tickets. We think tickets are kind of an evil way to communicate between teams. The concept is if you've got a JavaScript guy in your app project, you don't send him a ticket to ask him to build something. You generally have a story and a backlog someplace. So the DevOps guys are participating as first-class members of the app teams.
DevOps people.
That's what, okay. So if I'm about to say guys, I'll do this. So DevOps.
People.
Where was I? I was talking about something. What was it? Anyone? Tickets are evil. Yes, tickets are evil. So what we've moved to is the DevOps stories are stories in the backlog and in the project backlog. So fundamentally, if they need an environment built to support something they're doing, we know about that because we're at the stand-up. And we create that as a backlog story, and we go through backlog grooming and sprint planning like anybody else would. We've kind of moved pretty much to that style of a model of doing what we're doing. And then it's just been a question of kind of scaling that and the interesting wrinkles that happen as we do that. So, questions?
Thanks. That was awesome. I want to see. Does anybody else want to share a story? How it's worked for you, Tony? You've got a blue shirt on. You have stepped forward by default. So before Tony comes up, again, I want to say DevOps Days Minneapolis. Talk to people like this in person, over beverages or otherwise. Mini bar in all caps is your discount code.
All right. Hey, I'm Tony. I work at Target. I guess one of the things that I would touch on for like bigger companies like Target is the importance of socializing like the why around DevOps. Because I mean, you remember the chart that Donnie showed with the bigger the company and the less that people were engaged on this. I think it has to do with how long it takes to spread to that kind of scale in people. People don't scale as easily as computers. So we've had areas where maybe middle management has said, we're going to do this for our groups, and I don't know if it's because the individual team managers weren't bought in and clearing away time for their engineers. The engineers weren't bought in, but it was like pulling teeth to work with those groups to implement automation or whatever. And then we've got teams lining up asking for help, saying, hey, we just want one person from your team to sit with us and help us do this. It's just like night and day in some areas. And I totally think it's because of the socializing and getting buy-in from all levels. Another thing that's worked for us is, like I said, getting one person from our team. So my team was one of these early teams that was stubbed to look at automation. And one of the things we've been doing is these like 30-day challenges where we focus on like one business need and get people from all the teams required to sit in a room for 30 days. We have everyone there do basically like mini sprints, like 2 sprints a day, stand up at the beginning of the day, stand up in the middle of the day, use like Kanban boards, or sometimes we put it in like an online tool like version 1 or something, and try to get things done really quickly. With short sprints, we can see if there's something that's not progressing and try to attack the problem right away. But it gets teams that are coming from an old mentality this quick ability to see what's possible and really learn skills really fast in an immersive experience. We've had one of my teammates working with a team, and they're finishing up, and he was sitting next to one of their developers looking at building up a dev environment using OpenStack and using Chef and Test Kitchen. And the guy was trying to get his attention when my manager was sitting there next to him and talking, and my coworker said, well, did you bring up the stuff? Did you bootstrap your agent to the boxes? Did you set the recipes in the run list and upload the attributes to the Chef server? He's like, yeah, I did that. He's like, you're done. The guy said, well, what do you mean? You're done. You've got it. Go log in and check it out. He's like, "It can't be done." He didn't realize like that was it, and it was like just a light bulb moment for him. So.
Thanks a lot. That's probably about all the stories we got time for, unfortunately. But I want to again say, if you want to talk more about this, DevOps Days is the place to go. If you spot anybody in these blue shirts today and want to talk more about what it's like there, come find us. And thanks a lot for coming.